In this presentation, I want to talk about writing and writing theory and what happens when we write, just to help you maybe get some fluency as a result of understanding what happens when we write. So this presentation is called Writing Essentials. And the first point I want to make is that we write from different states. Now, we used to call this left and right brain, but these terms have become very old-fashioned now and people don't use them all that much. But I just want to make links between left and right brain and the kind of states of writing that we write from. So we tend to write from a creative state and then a state that is much more editorial. And it's very important for writing because often what happens is we write only from that editorial state. And that creates a whole bunch of problems. Whereas what we should be doing is writing from the creative state and then bringing that internal editor in to fix our writing, when we need it. So in terms of writing, it's very important that we understand that we have this internal editor. And that internal editor comes from, people who've taught us how to write, who've marked our writing. It comes from parents, it comes from friends, it comes from anyone who, you perceive to critique what you do. But it also comes from imagined critique. So if you think somebody may say something about your writing, then your internal editor might kick in. And the internal editor is really someone who, it's that part of you that is trying to protect you. So the internal editor is what says to you, don't write that because people will laugh at you, or don't write that because, they'll know that you shouldn't be doing this PhD. So the internal editor is trying to protect you, and what he or she is trying to do is to make sure that you don't get hurt. So, we need that kind of part of us, but we don't want that part of us to take over. Now, what happens with writing is that kids write from the creative side of their brain until about grade 4. And then after that, the focus of writing becomes grading and being correct. And then there's the shift over into writing from this internal editor state. So instead of creating, we move straight away into correcting. So what I'm suggesting to you here is that we need to shift this. And we need to have, at the beginning stage of a project, where you work from that creative stage. And then when you move into fixing up your drafts, that's when you call that internal editor in. So we need to separate these two phases. And the reason why is because in order to generate creative, innovative thinking, which is what you're doing with a research project. I mean, research is about innovation. What you're trying to do is, what you need to have happen if you want to be creative is you need to have these three conditions. So you need an environment of no criticism, including self-criticism, while ideas are being developed. You need ideas to flow freely in a non-linear stream of consciousness, unordered manner. And then you need to have lots of ideas. So ideas generate more ideas. So if you're working in an environment of no criticism at the beginning of a project, then you don't censor yourself and you allow your mind to make connections that you wouldn't make if you were censoring yourself. If you have ideas flowing in this stream of consciousness way at the beginning of a project, again, you allow yourself to make connections. If you're cutting them off as soon as you've had one thought, you obviously don't get to that point where you can make those connections. And the same thing with ideas is if you have lots of ideas, then you can do something with that, rather than having one idea and then criticizing yourself that that's not the best idea. So the creative state, when you're writing from the creative state, is allowing these things to happen. So not criticizing yourself when you begin writing, allowing yourself to write freely and without censorship, and then making decisions later about whether or not you should keep this, and having lots of writing. The more writing you have, the more you can choose from. So the creative state of writing, or right brain writing, is where you write from this creative state. You write lots of things. You don't censor yourself. You allow yourself to come up with ideas that you might not even be aware that you have. You engage with the chaos of that creative state, and then at a later point, you begin to order it. Writing from this creative state is extremely satisfying. It's often very coherent, metaphorical, and meaningful. And this is where you begin to enjoy writing, when you write from this state. Since we're schooled into writing from that editor's state, you need to encourage yourself to write from this creative state. So anything that is illogical or playful will help you do this. So writing to music, using art or photographs as a springboard into writing, using metaphors. So if you take your research and you say, my research is like, and then you write about that, that will get you into this creative phase. So I'm not suggesting that we need to, excise the editor and kill him off or her off, but rather that we need the editor at the later stages of writing. And I'm going to explain why now. When you sit down to write, there are so many things happening when you sit down to write your first paragraph. All sorts of things need to go into beginning that first sentence. And this is why writing is difficult. I mean, it's hard to see from this slide because I've transferred it from a different program and it hasn't come out perfectly. But that's not important. What's important here is that when you sit down to write that paragraph, you have to think of a whole host of things. You're choosing words, you're constructing sentences, you're thinking about the tone, the style, the audience, the rules of grammar, the spelling, all sorts of mechanics to do with writing. You're thinking about how to write the paragraph, cohesion, the academic conventions, your audience, etc. So all of those things are happening in that moment that you sit down to write. And that's why writing is difficult. Then layered on top of that is a whole range of discourse issues. You might be a woman writing in a male-dominated area. You might be a black writer in an area where race is contentious. So whatever social conditions exist, they impact on how we write as well. So those issues of power, gendered relations, race, racialized relations, affect how we write and what authority we have as a writer. We never come to writing as a tabula rasa. We're always bringing meanings from other texts, from other situations, from our previous writings, as well as engaging with texts and meanings from other texts. When we write, especially in academic contexts, we are negotiating the discourse and we're developing our identities as a scholar. So our voice is really our identity. And, we're positioned in the text by the discourse, and we can actually position the text as well. So we're positioned in the text and we're positioned by the text, and we can negotiate that position. So all of these things are happening on top of the mechanics of writing. And then there's the third layer, which is the psychology or the emotional laden aspect of writing. So when you sit down to write, you're carrying with you, notions of self-esteem that perhaps you didn't do so well in the last paper, or you were criticized heavily by your supervisor. You might have perceptions that you really don't have talents in terms of writing and that you'll be exposed at any point. You might be focused on the errors and trying to be perfect so that you won't have any errors. You might feel, quite rightly, that your writing is tied to perceptions of intellect, and that if you write this one very poor sentence, everyone will be able to see that intellectually you're not very strong, which is obviously not true, but this is what we think when we write. We also feel that once we've written that sentence, it's there for everyone to see. We'll be exposed. We can't change it once it's published. Writing induces huge amounts of anxiety and all sorts of fears. And one of the most, one of the biggest problems is this internal critical voice that is always on our shoulder when we write. So writing is emotionally laden. So what I've tried to show you through these 3 different layers of writing, the kind of mechanics of writing, the discourse of writing, and the psychology of writing, is why writing is so difficult. When you begin a sentence with the, you have all of these things happening at the same time. And it's no wonder you decide to get up and go and do something else. Writing is difficult, and academic writing is particularly difficult. So that's why we need to break it up into stages of writing, so that you're not having to deal with all these things at the same time. And this is called process writing. So the stages of writing is having some kind of pre-writing phase, and then moving into a writing phase, which is really about writing a draft, and then moving into a revision phase where you fix up that draft, and finally into an editing phase where you begin to craft the draft. So some techniques that you can use to help you access that creative side as well as moving into the writing process is free writing, mind mapping, sketching, and of course using the writing process itself. If you haven't come across free writing before, it's well worth trying to figure out how this works. And it's one of the ways that you bypass your internal editor. So you set a timer for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then you write quickly. So you don't think, you don't censor yourself, you don't criticize yourself, you don't worry about mistakes. You don't go back and correct, you just keep moving forward. And this is where you're encouraging stream of consciousness writing, lots of ideas, and you're keeping that self-criticism quiet. Then once you've finished at the end of your 10 minutes, you take your text and you have a look at it, and there might be 1 or 2 sentences you can keep, and the rest you throw away. Now, the thing with free writing is that it's like anything else. It's like running, that you need to practice and you need to develop the skill. And you'll get to a point where you can free write and actually you'll keep most of what you've written. In the beginning, you might feel like you're writing rubbish, but really what you're doing is you're learning to write without that critical voice, and you're learning to write in a creative state. So it's very important to persevere. And there are different ways to free write. You can free write with no thoughts in mind and just go for it, or you can have directed free writing where you can focus on a specific concept or topic or paragraph or section in your chapter or thesis. And the assumption behind free writing is that you actually know quite a lot about what you want to write about, but your internal editor stops you from saying that. So with free writing, you're often writing and then saying, my goodness, I didn't realize I knew that. It's a very useful technique. It helps you with fluency, it helps you with creative ideas, and it'll help you get your writing done. So definitely use it. Mind mapping is very similar to free writing. This is also called organic mapping or spider diagramming. And really this is brainstorming onto a piece of paper in a visual way. So you would have a topic at the middle of your piece of paper, and then you would freely associate things that would go with that topic. And the point here as well is not to criticize yourself, not to censor yourself, but to engage really creatively in as many ideas as you can think of. And again, like free writing, there are many ways of using mind mapping. You can use mind mapping to organize things. You can use mind mapping to generate ideas. But how it gets you into this creative state is that you're using that stream of consciousness thinking, and the more ideas you have, the more you'll be able to work with those ideas. The other thing that mind mapping does is it allows you to see the relationships between things. Writing happens in a very linear fashion, and you often can't see the relationships. The more color, patterns, and symbols you use, the more you'll move into that creative state. The last technique, which I encourage a lot in my workshops and classes, is sketching. And you don't need to be an artist here. I mean, really the sketches are for yourself. They're not for anybody else. but you might be able to develop a sketch into a diagram that you use in your research. But really what I'm talking about here is being able to, for example, sketch your research onto one piece of paper. If you can sketch your research onto one piece of paper, you'll be able to see the relationships, the big picture, the complexities in that sketch. So, visual thinking, there's a lot of research on this, is often very insightful, and it can access complex ways of thinking about things that writing in a linear fashion often can't. So if you get stuck, then just draw the section that you're working on. Draw who's in your research. Draw the path that your research is taking. And what it does is that it helps you just to see things a little bit differently, perhaps more holistically, and it jogs you out of ordinary ways of thinking and into that creative state. So sketching to me is a very important component of this creative state of writing. And then, of course, the writing process, which is going through a phase where you do a lot of free writing, reading, writing notes, drawing mind maps, not mind amps, and collecting material. Then you move into a phase where you draft, you write the draft. And for me, I often set aside time to write the draft. And the importance of the draft is that you get the whole story down in one sitting, so that you have a beginning, you have a message that you're getting across, and you have the end. So for me, it might take me a day to get a paper drafted. And what I'm talking about there is that the draft will be very messy. It'll have lots of gaps. There'll be notes to myself where I'll be saying, fill in this bit here, go and read some more on this, but the whole story is down. And then once you've got that draft done, which is arguably the most difficult part, then you revise and revise until you've reached a point where the paper is crafted. So this process is not linear. It doesn't happen like this, where you have a pre-writing phase, a drafting phase, and a revision phase. You might do a pre-writing phase, write a draft, go back to read more, write notes, come back to expand on your draft, and then revise. So it's not this kind of simple process. Just a quick word about the internal critic, because this is something that's so important in writing, and this is what paralyzes writers, is this internal critic. The internal critic, as I mentioned before, is made up of people who have actually criticized our writing, sometimes very unfairly and sometimes fairly. And it's also made up of imagined voices. So the point is, it doesn't matter whether people have criticized your writing in the past, and it doesn't matter whether you fear being criticized in the future. The most important thing is that if you allow that voice to take control, then you will find it very difficult to write fluently, because that voice will stop you in an attempt to be perfect, which is an impossible task, and it will not allow you to take risks, to experiment, or to enjoy writing, from that creative state. So it's very important in writing that you recognize that this internal editor stops us from writing, and that there are times when we need to keep this voice quiet. But obviously you don't want to criticize that voice. You don't want to say, oh, I've got a terrible internal editor. You want to say to your internal editor, you know what? I'm moving into a creative phase now. It's time for you to be quiet. I'll call you back in when we get to the revision phase. So you're keeping it quiet when you're generating writing, and you're bringing it back when you're revising writing. Sometimes it's very difficult to hear that voice because it's become so internalized. So what I would suggest is that you get a little thing. I used to raid my kids' toy boxes and come up with these little monsters, and then I would externalize my critical voice. I'd put it next to my computer, and I would say, you keep quiet now. When I'm finished this, you can come back. So externalize your critical voice. It's very important in the early stages of a paper or a chapter, when you're writing the draft, that you be kind to yourself. The worst thing that you can do is to be critical. So you don't want to have that voice saying, You're a terrible writer. Why did you think you could do this? You want to say, you know what, let's have a go at this. Let's just try it. Let's see what we have to say here. Let's see what this first draft is like. So be kind to yourself. It's very important and it'll help with your fluency. And again, I can't stress enough the importance of draft. That as long as you slap something down, you get something down, anything, you get anything down on paper, you can then fix it up. Every time you're putting something on paper, you're refining your thinking. So the very first step is to get something down. And then once you've got something down, you can fix it up. To try and write perfectly the first time means that you probably won't get any writing done at all. So this is what you want to do. You want to, this is what Anne Lamott calls it. You want to get a downdraft where you get something down. Then you go through the updraft where you fix it up. And then you go through the dental draft, which she says is where you pick at every tooth. And that's revision. So the first draft is always awful. It's always rough. It'll have huge gaps. It's made up of bits and pieces of your writing from the pre-writing phase. And it's for your eyes only. This is not the draft that you give to anybody else to read. This is for you to get the whole message down, the whole story down. Once you've fixed it up a bit, then you can give it to somebody else to read. So this is how it works. You write lots of bits and pieces, and you can do that through free writing, through notes, through sketching, through mind mapping. Then you write your way into the paper. So if you get stuck in writing the first draft, then you write about why you're getting stuck. So you write your way through the difficulties as well. And you use free writing. At any point where you get stuck, you set that timer and you just write for the amount of time that you've set. Okay, so just to sum up, that we need both these stages, these states of writing. We need both the creative state and the internal editor. And we need to have, in order to get something finished, we need to break it down because writing is difficult. So you break it down into manageable components, you write a draft, and you fix up that draft. When you're writing the draft, you want to write from that creative state. When you're fixing it up, you can bring that internal editor back in. And then the 3 key techniques: free writing, organic maps or mind maps, and sketching. Okay, so this is the basics of writing theory, and hopefully it'll help you to develop writing fluency, and it'll get you away from that place where you feel stuck and overly critical of yourself to a place where you can carry that criticism. You can put it away for a while, allow yourself to write, and then fix it up. Okay, thank you.